Hi there, and welcome to the podcast. This is part two of Human Readable. Part one was about a week and a bit ago. We had a little interlude there as I got the opportunity to include in my podcast feed the podcast of Craphound that came from Escape Pod. They did a really good job on it. Gosh, I was really happy to hear it. And thank you to everyone who wrote in to say how much you enjoyed it. I thought it was terrific. I'm presently on the train to Brussels on my way to Antwerp to give a talk and a reading tonight. And the Channel train, having just pulled out of Waterloo Station. I just got back from New York, which was really fun. I judged a contest for Motorola. That was my putative reason for being there, but I also saw some friends and colleagues. Unfortunately, nowhere near enough friends and colleagues. There are about 1 million people that I missed on this trip. My sincere apologies if you're one of them. It was just 6 days and not enough time, and I did everything I could to squeeze in as many people as I could. I'd have loved to have spent more time, although, of course, it was very, very cold. Some good news lately. My story, I, Robot, is a finalist for the British Science Fiction Award. That's pretty cool news, and the story itself was released under a Creative Commons license on infinitematrix.net. You can download it from there. I am excited to report that we just won the election in Toronto that I've been hoping that we'll win. We threw out a member of Parliament named Sam Bulte, who's from the Liberal Party, who had taken lots of money from the copyright industry and had subsequently made laws that were quite to their benefit and proposed more laws that were even more to their benefit. And we got rid of her and we put in Peggy Nash, who's the NDP candidate who I quite like. And those of you who read Boing Boing will have seen that we campaigned very hard for Ms. Nash and very hard against Ms. Bulte, and I'm really glad to see that it paid off. It was the single largest swing of any seat in Toronto at this election. Very exciting. Another bit of political news, the Digital Content Protection Act has come down in the Senate, and those of you who are American citizens, I urge you to go and do a little reading on this. This is an act that would limit all new technologies to only permitting what are called traditional customary uses, which is to say no new uses. So it would freeze technology in amber and require anyone building a new technology to get permission from the FCC after certifying that their technology didn't allow you to do anything new. I think that's a disaster in the waiting. Other good news is very shortly I'll be blogging this, but Graham Linehan's The IT Crowd will premiere on Channel 4 and also on the internet. Linehan's the guy who wrote Father Ted, which is, for my money, the funniest TV show ever made, ever. And he wrote a TV show about systems administrators, and I had the good fortune to sit down with him a couple of times and talk to him about geek culture and to hook him up with some geeky friends of mine. And the first episode is going to be live on the internet at the same time as it's live on the air, which I'm really looking forward to since I never turn on my TV. Boing Boing, the weblog I co-edit, is a finalist for 3 Bloggy Awards. You can go to those at 2006.bloggies.com for Best Group Weblog, Best Weblog Overall, and the Lifetime Achievement Award, which is really exciting. What an honor to once again be nominated there. And my story, Appeals Court, has been posted to the internet on Infinite Matrix. It's a story that Charlie Strauss and I wrote. It was the sequel to a story we wrote for sci-fi.com called Jury Service, quite gonzo. The other news that's in the waiting is on the 5th and 6th of February, I will be going to Geneva for the LIFT conference, and I hope I'll see you there if that's local for you. So without further ado, let's just get on with the recording and this week's installment of Human Readable. Thanks. They rolled into the parking lot for his family's shul section of the giant graveyard a few minutes after 1 p.m., just over an hour late, along with the majority of other attendees, all of whom had to navigate manually. "Where are your sisters?" Raynor's mother said, even before he'd kissed her cheek. Raynor screwed his face up in a scowl and dug in his pocket for a yarmulke. "Do I know? Stuck in traffic, Ma. The grid's down everywhere." Trish watched this bemusedly, in her cool, loose cotton apron trousers and blouse. She stuffed her toe conspicuously, and Raynor turned to her, and it was as though he'd forgotten she was there. She felt a second's irritation, then a wave of sympathy, as she saw the spasm of anxiety cross his face. He was nervous about her meeting his fam, and nervous about who would arrive when, and nervous about where his sisters were with their enormous families and meek husbands, trapped somewhere on Southern California's squillion-mile freeway network. "Ma," he said, "this is my friend Trish." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Feinstein," Trish said. The old woman was remarkably well preserved, her soft skin glowing with heat flush, her thick hair caught in a tight bun, and covered with a little scarf that reminded Trish of Rayner's yarmulke. She wondered if she should be wearing one too. Mrs. Feinstein's eyes flicked quickly to her shoes, up her legs and boobs, and to her face and hair, and then back to her face. She opened her arms and drew Trish into a hug that smelled of good, subtle perfume, though Trish knew so little about scent that she couldn't have said which. "Call me Reba, darling," she said. "It's so good of you to come." And then she was off, hustling to corral a wayward knot of horseplay-aged cousins, stopping to shake hands with the deceased great-uncle's poker bodies in their old-man pants, golf shirts, and knit yarmulkes bobby-pinned to their thinning hair. Trish took stock. Looked like every other graveyard she'd been in, which wasn't that many. At 35, she'd been to half a dozen family funerals, a couple of college buddies who'd OD'd or cracked up their cars, one favorite poli-sci teacher's service, so she was hardly an expert on boneyards, but something was amiss. "What's with the pebbles on the headstones?" she whispered to Rayner, who was scanning the road for signs of his sisters. "Huh? Oh, you drop those on the monument when you visit the grave as a sign someone's been there." "Oh," she said, and began to cast about for a pebble she could put on his great-uncle's headstone once it was unveiled. There were none to be found. The ground had been picked completely clean. Looking at the thousands and thousands of ranged marble headstones, each topped with a cairn of stones, and not just stones either, toys and seashells and small sculptures she saw now, and she understood why. "What are you doing?" Rayner asked. He might have been irritated, or just nervous. It was hard to tell when he was fretting, and he was clearly going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. "Looking for pebbles," she said. He said, "Fuck," very quietly. "I meant to bring some, damn it. I've got 20 relatives buried here, and we're going to go past every single tombstone before we get to leave, and I don't have a single rock." "Can't you leave toys or other stuff, like on those stones?" "Yeah," he said, "I suppose, if I had other stuff." She opened her purse and pulled out the Dolphin Dildo cell phone. "You still need this?" she said. He smiled, and his forehead uncreased. "You're a genius," he said. She set it down on the pavement and brought her heel down on it hard, breaking it into dozens of fragments. "All the pebbles we'll ever need," she said, picking them up and handing them to Rayner. He put his arms around her shoulders and squeezed. "I'm awfully fond of you, counselor," he said, kissing her earlobe. His breath tickled her ear and made her think of that crazy animal, new relationship energy sex they'd had the night before. She was still limping, and so was he, and she shivered. "You too, Stakey Paste," she said. "Now introduce me to all of your relatives." "Introduce you?" he groaned. "You don't think I remember all of their names, do you?" Afterwards, they formed a long convoy back to the nearest family member's house. A great-aunt, a second cousin. Rayner was vague, navigating by keeping everyone in sight, snaking along the traffic jam that appeared to have engulfed the entire state, if not the whole coast. "You made that law, yes? We've heard all about you." This was the 6th time someone had said this to her since they'd arrived, and Rayner had made her a plate of blintzes, smoked salmon, fresh bagels, boiled eggs, and baby green salad with raspberry dressing, and then had been spirited away into an endless round of cheek-pinching and intense questioning. She'd been left on her own, and after having a couple of grave discussions with small children about the merits of different toys, she'd been latched onto by one of the relatives and then passed from hand to hand. "I was involved in it," she said, "but I didn't write the law." "Look at you, so modest, you're blushing," the relative said. She reached out to steady a cut-glass vase as it wobbled in the wake of 2 small boys playing keep-away with a third's yarmulke, and Trish realized that this was probably the hostess. "This place is just supercalifragilistic," she said, with an economical gesture at the tasteful Danish furnishings, the paper books in a handsome oak bookcase, the pretty garden out one side window and the ocean out the back window. "Thank you," the great-aunt said. "My Benny loved it here." She missed it up. Trish finally added 2 and 2, remembered the Benjamin chiseled into the marble headstone, and the blank spot on the other half of the tombstone, and realized that this wasn't just the hostess, this was the widow, and she felt about for a thing to say. "It was a beautiful ceremony," she said. She had a couple napkins tucked in the waistband of her pants, and without thinking she extracted one and folded an angle into it, reaching for the corner of the great-aunt's eye. "Look up," she said, and blotted the tear before it could draw a line of mascara down the widow's cheek. The old woman smiled a well-preserved smile that reminded Trish of Raynor's mom. "You're a sweet girl," she said. "Me, I'm not so good with names, and so I've forgotten yours." "I'm Trish," Trish said, bemusedly. Raynor's grammar got Yiddishized when he wasn't paying attention, and she adored the contrast between its shtetl credibility and his witty, smooth, public banter persona. It had attuned her to little phrases like, "Me, I'm not so good." The widow shook her hand. "I'm Dorothy. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Would you like to come out in the garden with me?" Once they were seated, young male relatives materialized and set up shade umbrellas and brought out trays of iced juice. "They're not after the inheritance, you know," the old woman said with a snort. "Their parents are very well off. They don't need for money. They just adore me because I've spoiled them rotten since they were babies, and I take them swimming and to Disneyland." "You have a beautiful family," Trish said. "Do you have a big family, too?" The old woman put on a pair of enormous sunglasses and sipped at her pink grapefruit juice. "Not like this one," she said. There were a couple hundred people in the house, and Raynor had spent the whole car ride back from the cemetery fretting about all the relations who hadn't made it. "Oh, this one. Well, this one is a special case. This family accumulates other families. My Benny had a small family, and when he married me, they just joined us. All the high holidays we ate here or at my parents' place, God rest them. Your family is in D.C.?" "All over. But you're from D.C., no?" "Well, not really. I grew up in Chicago and Seattle." "But you made that law." "I really didn't, honestly. I was clerking for a Supreme Court judge when the case was heard, and then I wrote his dissenting opinion, and when we lost, I quit and went to work for a PAC that was agitating for copyright reform to accommodate free expression, and that was when Senator Sandoller got voted in, and they started the Intellectual Property Committee and made her chairman, so I joined her staff as a policy wonk. So I worked on it along with a couple thousand other people, not counting the millions who contributed to the campaign and people who knocked on doors and so on." "How old are you, darling?" 35, she said. "At 35, I was having babies. Listen to you. Listen to what you've accomplished. I'm proud just to listen to you. Raynor is lucky to have you. You two will get married." Trish squirmed and felt her face grow hot. None of them really believed in marriage. Whenever anyone brought up the subject of Raynor, he'd grimace and say, "Are you kidding? It would make my mother far too happy. She'd keel over from joy." There was some kind of disturbance down the beach, one that had been growing steadily over the past several minutes, and now the relatives were all turning their attention that way to a couple of small boys in miniature suits who were ruining the shine on their shoes, running in the sand like lunatics. Something in the way they were running, the distant expression she couldn't quite make out on their faces. It made her think back to high school, to working as a beach lifeguard on Lake Michigan in the summers, and before she knew what she was doing, she'd kicked off her shoes and was running for the shore, her legs flashing immodestly through the vents in her apron trousers. She was still yards away from the hissing surf when she began to assess the situation. There was the small boy bobbing in the ocean, where the undertow had spit him up after sucking him under. There was the swimmer, unconscious on the beach, face down. Couldn't tell if his chest was moving, but that small boy was in a suit, not swim trunks like the swimmer, and that meant that he was part of Raynor's family, which she had begun, on the 8th date no less, to think of her own, and so she had him as her primary target before she reached the sea. She didn't bother finicking with the buttons on her top, just grabbed the collar and yanked, leaving her in a bra that revealed less than some bikini she owned, but did so through a cunning arrangement of lace, mesh, and structural engineering that was probably illegal in Texas. She undid the bows on each hip, holding up her pants, and stepped out of them, leaving behind a very small pair of white panties whose primary design consideration had been to avoid showing lines through thin trousers, with modest coverage of all her nethers coming in a distant second. She plunged into the water without hesitation, moving swiftly but surely, taking care to keep her feet dug in against the undertow as she waded out towards the young boy. She was a strong swimmer, but the water was shockingly cold after the heat of the garden and the buzzing afternoon, and it sucked at her calves and legs like a jacuzzi intake. Her breath roared in her ears as she broke the swells, and then she was soaked by a succession of breakers, and then she had the boy's little hand. She hauled him to her, seeing that he was only 5 or 6, and that his pouting lips were alarmingly blue, and his skin was as pale as cream. She scooped the water out of his mouth, hooked her arm around his neck and tilted his head back and began to slosh back towards shore. When she was waist-deep and modestly revealed in a bra that she was quite certain had gone completely transparent, she pinched his nose and blew into his mouth, not quite getting her mouth out of the way before he vomited up a gush of salt water, blintzes, Diet Coke, and bile. She spat and wished that she could duck her head and get a mouthful of ocean to rinse with, but she couldn't without dunking the boy too, so she hauled him up out of the water and handed him to the relative who was standing with his arms extended on the shore, his fine leather shoes soaked with cold sea water. She looked for the swimmer, saw that he was still face down in the sand. You, and you, she said, pointing at three young cousins whose eyes were flicking from her boobs to her crotch. White underwear, Christ, why white underwear today? To the boy on the sand, who was now mobbed with relatives whose hubbub had reached deafening proportions. Go to the house, find an old-fashioned phone and call emergency services. Tell them where we are, and that we have 2 drowning victims, one a child, neither breathing. What are you going to do? The tallest of the 3 managed to make eye contact long enough to say, find a cell phone, call emergency, tell them where we are, 2 drownings, not breathing. Right, she said. Come back when you're done and tell me that it's done. You, she said, picking out 2 tall uncles who looked like they'd worked out or played sports before they found whatever careers had paid for the nice suits they were wearing. Carry him here and lay him down on his side. She looked for Raynor and found his ass sticking out of the scrum around the boy. She snagged him by the belt and dragged him back. Raynor, she shouted. His forehead was scrunched, but he was clear-eyed and grim and looked like he was listening to her, which she found very pleasing. You need to make everyone back at least 5 steps from that kid and make them quiet down, she said. Right, he said. He took off his jacket and handed it to her. Hold it yourself, she snapped. I've got things to do. It's to wear, he said. She surprised herself with a grin. Thanks, she said. The relatives were murmuring, or crying, or bickering, but Raynor hollered. Listen up, he said. All of you get over there by that rock now, or my girlfriend won't be able to save Jory's life. Go! And they went, amazingly, crushing back so quickly that they looked like a receding tide. The tall uncles deposited the swimmer in the sand between them, and she checked his breathing and saw that it was good. Turn him on his side and tell me if he starts to choke, she said, and turned to the little boy, struggling to remember her rescue breathing.